Hey there, it's Baker Betty and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to talk through the process of a standard bread recipe. All bread recipes sort of go through the same steps, and I want to talk about each one and what you need to look for in your dough. Bread recipes are a little bit unique because you need to think of them more as a guideline rather than a strict recipe that you want to follow. There are adjustments that you will want to make to your dough and your timeline as you go through the process, and this is all dependent on where you live and how cool or warm your environment is and the different ingredients that you will use. So let's talk through all the steps and I'll show you the different things that you need to look for as you are making your bread. So I have some more in-depth videos that go into what yeast is and all of the nuances of how it works, and I will link those in the description box, but let's do a really quick overview. So yeast is a fungus, which means it is a living organism. However, the dry type of yeast that we are going to work with today is asleep, and it needs to wake up in order to make our bread dough rise. Now, there are two different basic types of yeast that you're going to find in the grocery store. There's active dry yeast and there's instant yeast, which also might be labeled as rapid rise or quick rising yeast. Now, active dry yeast is the original form of yeast that came on the market when dry yeast was invented. And originally, it did need to be hydrated in some liquid before it went into your bread dough. However, almost all active dry yeast today does not actually need to be hydrated, and it can go right into your dry ingredients the same way instant or quick rising yeast can. But there might be some instances in which you would want to hydrate your yeast before you put it in your dough. So proofing your yeast is an optional step that can be done at the beginning of your bread recipe. And what this does is it just wakes your yeast up and it gives you signs that it is alive. You might want to do this if you're a little bit nervous about working with yeast and you want to make sure that your yeast is definitely active before it goes into your bread dough. Or you might also want to do it if you need things to move a little quicker, or if you're a little concerned that your yeast might be old. Yeast does become less active with age, so if you have some yeast that's been in your cupboard for a really long time, I would suggest proofing your yeast before you go forward with your bread recipe. So to proof your yeast, all you're going to do is take some of the liquid from your bread recipe, about 1/4 to 1/2 cup, and you do want the liquid to be warm, somewhere around 110 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And you're going to pour your yeast right into that liquid. Now you can do this with either active dry or rapid rise yeast. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to add a small amount of sugar. Now, if your recipe already calls for sugar, you can just use a little bit out of that quantity, just maybe about 1/2 teaspoon or so. If your recipe doesn't call for sugar, then you're just gonna add a little bit. What that sugar is going to do is it's going to wake your yeast up and give it something to feed on. So I'm just going to stir this up in my bowl with my warm liquid and that sugar, and you just want to let this sit for about 5 to 10 minutes. What's going to happen during that time is the yeast is going to wake up, it starts feeding on the sugar, and it will start creating CO2 gases, which will make the mixture start looking almost slightly carbonated. You'll see some bubbles popping to the top, and you'll also see some foaming action. So once you start seeing that in your mixture, then you can go ahead and move forward with your bread recipe. If you wait that 5 to 10 minutes and you do not see any activity at all, then you know you need to get some new yeast before you make your bread dough. So the next step of the bread process is to mix our dough. Now, for most standard bread recipes, you really don't have to be super concerned about the order in which your ingredients are combined. Some recipes might give you some specifics, but for the most part, we're going to be kneading our dough for a long period of time, and everything is going to get really well mixed together during that process. One of the most common misconceptions I see out there about the way you mix your ingredients is really avoiding your salt touching your yeast. Now, it is true that salt does slow down the fermentation of your yeast, but unless it's in extremely high quantities, it's not going to kill your yeast. And we actually want the salt to slow down our fermentation so that it doesn't get out of control. So don't be too concerned about that. We're just gonna throw everything in our bowl and mix our dough together. Now, in general, you're going to be working with warm liquid for your yeast dough. Warmth is going to get your yeast moving, but you always want to be careful that your liquid is not too hot. Yeast will begin dying around 140 degrees Fahrenheit, which feels pretty warm to the touch. So if you don't have a thermometer to check the temperature of your liquid, you might want to err on the side of it being a little cooler. So make sure it's slightly warm, but don't go too hot with your liquid or you can definitely kill your yeast. I always like to start the dough mixing process with something like a rubber spatula, and then I get my hands in there to really get it mixed together. So once the dough looks like it's sort of at this stage where most of the ingredients are pretty much absorbed into it, but it's not a very cohesive dough, then you can move on to the next step of the process, which is building your gluten structure. So I have my extra flour here and I'm going to go ahead and lightly flour my counter and I'm going to turn my dough out onto it. And what we are doing in this next step is building our gluten structure. And you can do this in your stand mixer if you have a dough hook, or you can do it by hand. And I really like people to practice doing it by hand. I think it's a good skill to have. And then you can really get a feel for your dough. So we start with a little flour on our counter. We're gonna add a little bit on top and to our hands. And we are going to just start this process of kneading our dough. There are a lot of different techniques for kneading bread dough by hand, but the way that I always teach my students is to think about using the heel of your hand to push the dough across your table. You never want to put the pressure down into the table. You want to go across your dough. So I'm going to push the dough across the table, and then I kind of use my fingers to grab it and bring it back towards me as I push and rotate the dough. And I'm just going to do this over and over again. Now I can see that my dough is super sticky. It's really sticking to my hands and it's really sticking to the countertop. If you don't already have one of these are called bench knives. They're very, very handy for lots of things in the kitchen and especially making bread dough. So I'm putting a little more flour down for myself and I'm going to continue this kneading process. Now most bread doughs, you want them to still stay fairly sticky. You want enough flour in your dough that it's not gluing itself to the table or gluing itself to your hands, but you don't want the dough to feel dry at all. So one thing I didn't mention when I was first mixing my dough is that I was actually using the smallest quantity of flour that my recipe listed to mix into my dough. So oftentimes bread recipes will list a range of flour. And you want to start with the smallest amount that's listed in that range, and then you will have some more flour on the side that as you're kneading your dough, you can work a little more in as needed. And this is one of the instances of where bread recipes are guidelines rather than very strict rules to follow. Now, kneading your dough does take a good amount of time. If you are doing this by hand, you're going to probably need to do it for about 8 to 10 minutes. If you're doing this in your stand mixer, you're going to want to go on about medium to medium high speed, and that should probably take around 6 to 8 minutes. So definitely a little bit of a workout when you're doing it by hand, but you can take breaks and just keep working your dough until it starts looking really, really smooth and it feels elastic to the touch. And I'll kind of show you what that looks like as I'm finished kneading here. So once you have kneaded your dough for a good 8 to 10 minutes, then you can go ahead and start checking to see where you're at with your gluten structure. Now, some bakers like to perform what's called the window pane test, where you really pull the dough apart to see how far it can stretch and see if you have a really strong gluten network. Now, depending on what kind of dough you have, if you have a lot of fat in your dough, it can be really difficult to perform this test and ever get a window pane. So for more beginner bread bakers, I like to perform a different test, which I think is a little easier to tell how your gluten structure is. So what you're going to do is you're going to kind of round your dough up into a ball and get a little bit of tension on the outside of your dough, and then dip your fingers in some flour and you're going to press down on the dough. Now, if you can see here on my dough, this hole is filling in pretty quickly when I press it. It's kind of bouncy. It could use a little bit more gluten. It's not really bouncing back up, but it's got a pretty good structure. If you press down into the dough and that hole just stays there and there's no bounciness to it, then I would definitely go ahead and give yourself some more time with kneading. But in order to perform this test, you do need to get a little bit of tension on the outside of your dough. So make sure you round it into a ball, and then you're going to perform the finger dent test. So I'm going to knead my dough a little bit longer here. So once you are happy with the amount you have kneaded your dough, we are going to move into what is called the bulk fermentation phase. Now, this is the first rise your dough goes through before it has been shaped. Some people will just refer to it as the first rise, and sometimes people also use the word proofing for this part of the process, but I like to reserve the word proofing for the second rise, which we'll talk about in a little bit, just to avoid any confusion. So bulk fermentation is first rise before your dough has been shaped. So I like to give my bowl just a little bit of oil, just to help keep the dough moist and not dry out while it's bulk fermenting. If there's a lot of fat in your dough, you might not need to do this, but I think it's a good little insurance policy so your dough doesn't dry out. So I'm just coating it, turning it to coat in my bowl, and now we're just going to cover the bowl and let it sit to rise. I really like to use shower caps to cover my bowls. So now we are going to let this bulk ferment until it has about doubled in size and it is full of air. I'll show you what the dough should look like when it's finished bulk fermenting. Now, most bread recipes are going to give you some guidelines about how long your bulk fermentation process should take. But keep in mind that this is going to vary depending on if you're using active dry or rapid rise yeast, and depending on how cool or warm your environment is and how cool or warm the liquid that you put into your dough was. So some signs you want to look for in your dough to determine if your bulk fermentation process is done is it should look like it has about doubled in size, and it should look puffy and full of air. It might not be super easy to see on this camera, but I can tell that there is air inside my dough. Another sign to look for is if it is rounded around the sides of your bowl. It's kind of mounding up to the center, and then I can tell that there is air inside my dough. One last little check you can do to determine if your dough has enough air in it is what is called the float test. Now, this isn't necessarily foolproof because you do need to be careful that you don't press all the air out of your dough when you do this, but you're just going to cut off a little piece of dough and drop it in some water. Now, if your dough is floating, that's a good indicator that it has quite a bit of air in it, and you can go ahead and move on to your shaping. So once the bulk fermentation is done, you can go ahead and shape your dough. Now, most bread recipes also call for a step that is called punching, which is when you just let all of the air out of your dough before you shape it. I don't like using the word punching because I really don't want you to be aggressive with this process. What you're gonna do is just push down with your fist in the center and bring your dough all towards the middle. And this is going to release most of the air out of it, which will help the bread dough rise in a way which will have a cohesive structure once it's baked. So before we shape our dough, you want to give yourself a little bit of flour on your countertop, and then we're going to turn it out on our counter. Now, I do have a shaping video in which I show quite a few different bread shapes. I will link that down in the description box if you want to see a few different ways you can shape your dough. But the main thing to keep in mind when you are shaping dough is that we're trying to build some tension on the outside of the dough so that your loaf rises in the direction that you want it to. We typically don't want it to spread out wide, we want it to rise up. So we're building some tension in the dough so that it will do that for us. The other thing you want to keep in mind when you're shaping dough is that whatever part of the dough is going to be folded in, you kind of want to keep that pretty much free of flour. If it's extremely sticky, you can give it a very light dusting, but we want the part that's folded in on itself to stick to itself. So if you use a lot of flour, it's really hard for it to build that tension. So I have some flour on my counter and I'm leaving the top of my dough free of flour. I'm just going to shape this into a classic sandwich loaf, and I'm using a light hand to make sure all of that air is pressed out of it. And then I'm going to start shaping the dough into my shape. So I'm going to give some tension up here at the top and fold that in towards the center, and then fold my top down to that seam that I just created. pressing to seal. So what I'm doing here is I'm building tension on my outside of my dough, and I'm going to continue rolling the dough in on itself, which is going to help it really rise up tall. And I'm going to seal the ends here. Now I can tell that this has good tension on it because as it's sitting here on my bench, it's holding its nice little package shape. It's not spreading out wide, which is what we want. That's great. Okay, so once you shape your dough, it is going to go into its second rising process, which is what we call proofing. We're going to let the dough fill with air again now that it's shaped, and then we will bake it. So just like our bulk fermentation phase, the timing of your proofing is going to vary based on the type of yeast you used and how warm or cool your environment is and how cool or warm the liquid was that you put in your bread dough. Warm temperatures are always going to move things along more quickly, and cool temperatures will always slow things down. So one of the most common questions I get about baking bread is how you know if your bread is done proofing. And the best way I have found to tell is to check on the tension when you press in on your dough. So I like to put a little bit of flour on my fingers and gently press in on my bread dough, and what I want to see are these holes very slowly filling in. If you remember, during our kneading process, we wanted the holes to fill in quickly because that was a sign that we had a really strong gluten structure. But we want these holes to fill in slowly as a sign that our bread is done proofing, to show us that there is enough air built up in our dough. So this is something that you're just going to have to kind of get used to the feel of. When these holes really spring back very quickly, that's a sign that you need to give it more time. But make sure that your fingers are floured and that the dough isn't sticking to your fingers, because if it sticks, then it might seem like it's springing back quickly when it's really not. I can see here that there's still a little bit too much tension in this dough. I would want this to go just a little bit longer. The holes are filling in a little bit slowly, but still pretty quickly, and so I want to give this dough a little longer. Now, this dough, in contrast, has actually gone too far. If you can see here, it's so full of air that it almost looks like it can collapse really easily. When I shake it, it just doesn't seem like it's very stable anymore. Because there's so much air in it, the gluten structure is actually becoming really weak. And my indentation is not filling in at all. It's just completely staying there. And that's because there's too much air in my dough, and I actually let it proof a little too long. Now I can still bake this and will still bake this, but what's going to happen is this is going to end up being probably a pretty dense loaf because that gluten structure is now very weak and it's not going to be able to contain the gases in it, and it's going to kind of deflate as it bakes. If I baked this loaf, which still needs a little bit more proofing time, it's still going to be a nice loaf of bread, but I might see it kind of split on the sides because it needed to build up a little more air in it. But this is just something that really takes a little bit of practice to kind of notice the signs and know if your dough is fully proofed. So just take your time and keep practicing. Just like any skill, it just takes practice and you'll get there. Now, there is one more optional step that is used really frequently in the bread baking process, which is called retarding the dough in the refrigerator. And what this means is putting your dough in a cold environment in the refrigerator at some point in the process to slow down the timeline. The reasons you might want to do this is to give yourself some more flexibility with your timing. It kind of is a pause button for your bread baking process. The other reason you might want to do this is to develop more flavor in your dough. As I mentioned earlier, cool temperatures are going to slow down the fermentation process, and a slower fermented bread is actually going to have more flavor than a bread that fermented really quickly. So sometimes people will make something like a pizza dough and they will put it in the refrigerator for even up to 3 days before they use it. And that really develops an intense flavor in their dough. Now, there are two main points in your bread making process in which the retardation stage is typically used. The first point is after your dough has been kneaded, so during that bulk fermentation phase. Now, this is the point in the process in which you can leave the dough in the refrigerator for quite a long period of time. Because your dough has not been shaped yet, you're not risking overproofing it by letting it sit in the refrigerator for a long time. So depending on the dough that you're using, you might be able to let it sit in there for 3 or maybe even more days. The second point in the process in which people use this step is after your dough has been shaped during the proofing stage. So say you wanted to make some cinnamon rolls and you wanted to bake them the next morning, you would make your dough all the way up to the point in which you shaped them, and then you're going to cover them and place them in the refrigerator overnight. Now, while they're in the refrigerator, they are going to slowly proof and they'll gain a little bit of volume. But depending on how quickly you put them in the refrigerator and how cold your refrigerator is, you might pull them out the next morning and they may not have really proofed that much at all. So then you would let them come to room temperature and gain some more air. So keep in mind that this retardation step can really be used with most bread recipes if you do need a little bit more flexibility with your timeline. So once your dough is finished proofing, you are going to go right into the oven with it. So keep that in mind when you are checking how far along you are in the proofing process. You're going to want to have your oven preheating so that it's ready for your dough as soon as it is done proofing. Now, before you go into the oven, you might want to brush something on top of your loaf, either oil or an egg wash, which is going to help with browning. If you brush oil over the top, you will get a nice golden brown crust, but it's a little more dull in color. While if you use an egg wash, that's going to give you that really nice shiny brown finish. So those both are optional for any bread recipe. So I really hope you found this video helpful for following a bread recipe. And if you have any questions, please leave those down in the comment section. I will do my best to answer them. I also have quite a few other videos on bread related topics, so we will leave the playlist link down in the description box, as well as the link for our sourdough playlist if you're interested in more advanced bread topics. I'll also leave some links for some of my favorite bread recipes down in the description. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. That really helps our channel, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a video. And I'll see you back here next time.